Welcome. Today we're diving deep, like microscopic deep, to meet the unsung hero inside every single one of your cells. I'm talking about an incredible, tireless little machine that builds, well, everything, from your hair to the enzymes digesting your lunch. It is literally building you, right now, this very moment.
So let's just jump right in with a big question. Have you ever wondered what tiny builder is responsible for putting together all the proteins that make up, well, you, your muscles, your brain, all the stuff that makes you, you?
Well, that little builder is the ribosome. The best way to think about it, it's the cell's essential protein factory. Seriously, it takes the genetic blueprints, we call that RNA, and just churns out all the complex machinery that makes life possible.
All right, so let's get into it. First up, what do these little factories actually look like, and where in the world do they even come from?
You know, if you could zoom way in with a super powerful microscope, what you'd see is just this tiny, dense little particle. But here's the amazing part. These things are everywhere. They are universal. You find them in every single living cell on the planet, from the simplest bacteria, those are the prokaryotes, all the way up to the complex cells that make up you and me, the eukaryotes. So a factory needs to be built somewhere, right? Well, for the ribosome, its life starts in a really special spot inside the cell's command center, the nucleus. There's an area in there called the nucleolus, and you can pretty much think of it as the factory that builds the other factories. It's very meta. Once a ribosome is put together, it gets shipped out to the main floor of the cell, the cytoplasm, and that's where it gets to work.
Okay, so now we know where they come from, but what are these little machines actually made of? Let's take a look at the blueprint. So what it comes down to is this. A ribosome is something scientists call a ribonucleoprotein. That's a fancy word, but all it really means is that it's a complex made of two things in almost equal parts. A special type of RNA called ribosomal RNA, or rRNA for short, and a bunch of proteins. All of it is just intricately folded together into this perfect little machine.
Now, even though these ribosomes are in every cell, they're not all exactly the same. There are kind of two main models, you could say. In those simpler cells, like bacteria, you get a smaller version. We call it the 70S model. But in complex cells, like ours, they're a bit bigger and heavier. That's the 80S model. And I know you're wondering what that S is all about. Don't worry, we're going to get to that in just a second.
So let's focus on our model, the bigger 80S one. How does this thing actually get assembled? Because here's a spoiler. It's not built in one solid piece. Let's dive into how it all comes together.
So yeah, our 80S ribosome actually comes in two separate pieces. You've got a big piece, the large 60S subunit, and then a smaller 40S subunit. Just picture them as two halves of this intricate machine just floating around separately inside the cell, basically waiting for the signal to snap together and start working.
And you know what that signal is? It's actually super simple. When the cell gets an order to build a protein, these little things called magnesium ions show up. They basically act like a magnetic key. Their presence is the trigger that lets the large and small subunits lock into place, and boom, you've got a complete functional factory ready to read its instructions.
Okay, now for that S I promised you. And this is where the math gets a little weird, in a really cool way. You'd think, right, that 60S plus 40S would equal 100S. Makes sense. But nope. When they combine, they form an 80S particle. So what gives? Well, that S doesn't actually stand for size or weight. It's a measure of how fast something sinks when you spin it really fast in a centrifuge. And because of the way these two weirdly shaped pieces fit together, they actually create a more compact shape than you'd expect. So the final product sinks a little slower. It's a super neat little lesson in cellular physics.
All right, our factory is built and ready to go. So now let's see the production line in action. This right here is where the magic really happens. So what's the ribosome's one and only job? Protein synthesis. That's it. It clamps onto a strand of messenger RNA, which is basically the blueprint that's been copied from your DNA, and it starts reading the code. It moves along that strand almost like a tiny little reader, translating the instructions and adding one amino acid after another to build a perfect protein chain.
Okay, but think about this. What happens when the cell is in a crunch? You know, when it needs tons of copies of the exact same protein and it needs them like right now. Building them one at a time with just one ribosome, that would be way too slow. Well, the cell has this absolutely brilliant solution. It's called a polysome. So instead of having just one lonely ribosome chugging along, that mRNA blueprint, a whole chain of them will hop on. It becomes a literal assembly line with a bunch of factories all reading the same instructions at the same time.
And the efficiency here is just staggering. It means the cell can crank out so many copies of the same protein in a tiny fraction of the time. This is cellular mass production at its absolute best.
All right, so let's zoom back out. Let's put this all together. Why does this tiny, tiny factory matter so much in the grand scheme of things?
Okay, so let's do a quick recap of the most important points. First, ribosomes are the protein-making factories in all cells. Period. Second, they're made of a mix of RNA and protein. Third, in our cells, they assemble from two parts, that weird 60S plus 40S math that gives us an ADS machine. And finally, to be super efficient, they form polysomes, which are basically these amazing assembly lines for mass-producing the proteins that literally keep us going.
And this whole thing leaves us with one last, really big thought to chew on. We've seen how incredible these little master builders are, right? But what happens when the blueprints they're reading, that messenger RNA, has an error in it? A typo in the code? Answering that question, well, that's the key to understanding a huge range of things, from genetic diseases to some of the most basic challenges that all life has to face.